And now, Richard Bausch.
My my 2-year-old niece, my 2-year-old granddaughter. It's been a week here, so who are all you people? My 2-year-old granddaughter and I was trying to get the TV going for them, and it wouldn't work. And I said, "Damn it, Bausch!" And she went, "You can't do it, Bausch." Daughter Lila riding down here with her older sister Emily. They went through Knoxville and they passed a Dick's sporting goods store. Lila said, "Hey, Dick's," and then she said, "Well, I've seen Dick's. I guess I can cross that off my bucket list." It's those dirty mouth kids up the block, you know. It's not. I hope I didn't embarrass anyone. I want to thank Wyatt and the whole crew. Megan, where's Megan? So wonderful. I mean, you know. And all of the others, I know they get categorized as the others, but Adam and all, you know, all of them. I have dyslexia, and I can't keep anything in my head. Okay, I want to give you a couple of laughs before I read this. It's not very long. So I'm going to tell you 2 limericks I wrote. They're both vaguely literary. Said a bearded old guy named Cervantes, "I wish I could wear women's panties. I'd soak them in gas and pretend that my ass is inflammable like my friend Dante's." I'm very proud of that. The name, quite unrhymable, is Bausch. Unless drunk, saying house, you say hausch. Or falling downstairs, your wife unawares, you put your hand to your mouth and say, "Ouch!" There was a great woman, quite Gabby, who wrote lots of stories, not shabby. She was never in Boston, but her name is Jane Austen, and I think she wrote Northanger Abbey. All mine, I'm very proud of them. There is a woman, a reaver, who prefers Bill Faulkner to John Cheever. When she tells you the surge of his prose gives her the urge to go down Moses, believe her. Okay, that's it, no more. And again, I hope and pray I didn't do anything but give you a couple of laughs. This is a story called In That Time. Back in late June of 1949, when I was 12 years old, I spent a morning with Ernest Hemingway. This was shortly after I had been hauled down to Cuba, deeply against my will, by my parents, whom I had begun to think of as the captain and his wife. The captain had retired from the Navy after 20 years' service and was following a friend from his time on a destroyer in the Pacific during the war. They were planning to begin a charter fishing business. The friend, who had left the Navy as the war ended, was already living down there, and the charter fishing idea was his. My father had wired him funds toward getting things set up. his half of the investment. It was a lot of money. The friend's name, all I ever knew about him, was Coldrow, nicknamed Cookie. He was supposed to meet us at the harbor in Havana. The captain and his wife sold things and gave away things and packed things with a kind of unspoken urgency, and the three of us boarded the SS Veendam Holland America line on the 17th of June. When we arrived, the morning of the 18th, Cookie wasn't there, so the captain rented us rooms a couple of blocks from the Floridita in a place called Pepe's. I think the building is still there under a different name. A big house with a double-decker porch and a cafe on the first level. There was no sign of Cookie and no word from him either. The address he had given my father turned out to be a burned-out cottage at the end of the Canal de Entrada. Someone told my father that a man fitting Cookie's description had lived there, but no one knew what became of him after the fire. He had just gone. There was supposed to be a boat, but there was no boat. There was a little dock, but no boat. So we stayed at Pepe's and the long days went by. The captain spoke Spanish, but his wife and I did not. They had been married only a little more than a year. They were either going to get used to each other or they never would. They never did. By the fourth day, he was ready to give up trying to locate Coldrow. He had stopped using the nickname by then, and instead of looking anymore for a place where we could set up house, he spent the next 3 days mostly in bed. The wife was jumpy and irritable, though she told me bravely that what he required now was rest, that we all must take time to acclimate. Money wasn't an immediate problem, even with the loss of what he had sent to Coldrow. He had 68 days retirement leave, a Navy pension after 20 years service, and income from an inheritance his first wife, my mother, left him. Of course, I had nobody and nothing to do, nowhere to go. I was just with them, the captain and his wife. "Clark," she said to me somewhere around the 10th or 11th morning, "go out and get us a newspaper and some bananas. Go busy yourself. Be useful. You make me nervous." Sitting on a sofa under the one tall window looking out on the city, with a book open on her lap and a cigarette between the index and middle fingers of her left hand, she put me in mind of a picture I'd seen on a paperback cover of a lady of shadows, though there was really nothing mysterious about her. She was a young woman who grew up in Virginia and had never been anywhere, and came from a family that catered to her whims in ways the captain never did. No doubt she found this exciting about him at first. Now she was too far from home, fairly dejected. But she looked chic anyway. Nails painted dark red like her lips, hair and a natural blonde perm. She was very pretty, and she had what I'd heard people call Betty Grable legs. The cigarette sent its twisting strand of blue smoke to the ceiling. I'd been trying again to get the radio tuned to something other than static. "They'll have newspapers at the Floridita. Go on, boy, get." My own mother died having me. I'd known this for as long as I could remember. And I'd spent most of my life with women my father hired to watch me. He was almost always gone in my growing up years, duty tours, the war, of course. But even when he was stationed where I could be with him, I had governesses, his expression, attending me regularly. It was easy enough to think of him as the captain. "Give him some money," he said now from the other room. "Really?" she called. "You need money down here? We have to pay for things down here even though we already sent money?" Then low to me, "There's some in my purse over there on the table." I brought the purse over to her, and she rummaged through the mess inside, a lot of little tubes, a cigarette case, a billfold, tissue paper, and compact. "Here," she held out a 10-peso note, folded so tight it wasn't much bigger than a postage stamp, "and get yourself an egg or something." The captain coughed in the other room. "Bring some fruit, any kind of fruit." "Bananas," she called to him. "I said a newspaper and bananas. I hate bananas, and you know it. Jesus Christ. You said any kind of fruit, Dwayne, and don't use that language. It's common. Shut your pie hole. How about that? Your father," she said to me, "is a common, uncouth, low-life person." "What are you telling him?" came from the other room. "It's not even 9 in the morning. A lot of people are in bed at this hour on a Saturday. Christ, any kind of fruit." That last was louder, meant for me, and I heard the strain he was under in his voice. He had more to worry about than losing money to a supposed friend, and though I was too young to understand it fully, I knew enough. He'd been duty officer when James Forrestal, former Secretary of Defense, jumped from a high window of the Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. 2 in the morning of May 22nd. He was found on the roof of the third-floor cafeteria wearing only pajama bottoms. I'd heard my parents talking about it the day it happened. I was in my bed, supposed to be asleep, and the captain's voice came low down the hall. The indignity of it, Abby. Pajama bottoms. He was a man of dignity. Something just doesn't add up. And then her voice. You're saying there was broken glass in his bed. I was there, I saw it. Broken glass, and his room was across the hall from the window where he went out or was thrown. Thrown? They know we formed a bond. A what? That's what he said. I even heard him say it over the phone. That's what he called it. He made a big deal about it. He said we had formed a bond, that we'd formed a bond because we were Navy men and were against helping the Zionists and the government, they hated him. This goes all the way up to the president. Truman's the one who, never mind. He and Truman didn't agree. That was in the papers. Forget I said that about the glass in his bed. You're kidding. Poor baby, you're imagining things. I was there in that room at 6 this morning. I came in and he wasn't there. Broken glass in the bed. Forget I said anything. I didn't say anything. Who would I talk to about it, honey? No, right. Dwayne, the man jumped. Come on. He was crazy. Explain the broken glass. I heard the shrug in her voice. He broke a glass. According to the papers and the radio news, Forrestal was quite outspoken about his anti-Zionist sentiments. My father did not like the Zionists either. I wasn't too sure at the time what Zionists were. I knew it had something to do with the Middle East and the new country carved out of partition. I had an idea anyway. That stuff about Palestine and Israel was hard to miss with the radio on every evening and the papers that piled up on the coffee table in the living room of our apartment in Rosalind. The captain believed the Zionists might have killed Forrestal and that there was a chance they'd be coming after him too. He didn't speak of this, but it was in the air, in the disquiet you heard in his voice. He and Forrestal formed the bond. He kept using the phrase, while Forrestal was hospitalized. Now Forrestal was dead. The facts were troubling him and her. I was in the middle of it all. Zionists, suicide, theft, murder, Cuba, where we knew no one, the uncertainty of everything, the sad captain and the sad captain's wife. I had all this in my head as I went out to get a newspaper. I didn't want to be near them anymore. When I came down the stairs from the top deck, there was Hemingway sitting in the cafe, a newspaper open on the table. Coffee at his elbow with a squat brown bottle of something on the other side of it. Right away, I knew who he was. I had been obsessed with lions in Africa, and the captain had a magazine with pictures of the author Hunter everyone called Papa. I knew the face, and now I heard the waiter say, "Otra cosa, Papa?" "A couple more fried eggs, Alejandro, with chorizo this time, please." "Subiendo." Hemingway looked at me and smiled. "And what's yours this morning?" It was a really wonderful smile. There was coffee in his beard, which still had some darkness in it close to the skin, and his mustache was ash-colored. He wiped the back of his hand across his mouth. He had on a black T-shirt, ragged, stained white shorts, and rope sandals. I saw hair on his legs, his big knees. I stood there gaping. "Why are you crying?" he said. I hadn't known I was. "Nothing," I told him. "Okay." He drank and went back to reading the paper. "Can I have that paper when you're finished?" I was being a brave, unhappy boy. He gave me a long, evaluative look, then poured into his coffee the last of whatever clear liquid was in the bottle and drank. His eyes were red, irritated looking, but friendly. "You had breakfast?" I shook my head. "Is that what you're crying about?" "No." "You want the paper that bad?" "No." He smiled again. "Tears from pain or from pique?" I stared. "Pique," he said. "You mad at somebody? Where are your people, your parents?" "Upstairs." They mad at you? You killed a lion, I said. I felt stupid. It was all I could think to say. I wiped my nose with my hand and then wiped my hands on my own dirty white shorts. You mad at me? He put his fingers against his chest. It was self-defense, I swear. I wish I could hunt lions, I got out. He took the other chair at the table and turned it. Sit down, partner. I did so. He turned a page of the paper and took a drink from the coffee cup. Alejandro, he said, the waiter, tiempo para el vino, amigo, un blanco frío. Si, papa. I'd like to go to Africa, I said. He shook his head very slightly, remembering something. Haven't been there in years. I did kill a lion, a big gazelle, and a charging buffalo, water buffalo. You know what that is, right? A great big thing with horns, black as outer space. He put the paper down and extended his arms into what looked like an embrace of something large, massive and ill-tempered, kill you for pure meanness. Then he reached into the pocket of his shorts, brought out a clean white handkerchief and held it toward me. Wipe your nose. I did. What's your name? Is a water buffalo fast? I said. He nodded, and there was the smile again. Had to finish one with my Bowie knife. Ever see a Bowie knife? No. Cut you in half. A man named James Black created it for Jim Bowie. You've heard of Jim Bowie? I wasn't certain, but I nodded. It did sound familiar. Created the thing just for a knife fight way back in 1827. Jim Bowie used it, too, in a big duel called the Sandbar fight, where he would have died if it wasn't for that knife. It saved him. Near as big as a broad blade sword, and this bull, I got him in the neck as he was coming over me, just missed getting trampled. I was speechless for a few seconds, trying to imagine it all. I saw a picture of you, I got out, with a lion. Alejandro bought a bottle of white wine and a bucket of ice in one glass. He set the glass down, opened the wine, and poured a little. Hemingway just nodded, so Alejandro poured a little more and then set the bottle into the ice. He picked up the squat brown bottle and the coffee cup. Would you like something to eat, he said to me in completely unaccented English. I think he was intentionally not noticing my sniffling. Hemingway lifted one hand at me, palm up. It looked like it might weigh 10 pounds, that hand. Well, what do you say, kid? It's on me. Eggs, I managed, wiping my nose with the handkerchief, and bacon. You like the yolk soft? Yes. He said to Alejandro, 3 sunny side up, amigo, and 5 strips of bacon, and do the eggs in the bacon fat, and an English muffin. He looked at me. You like orange juice? I nodded. Tell us your name. I said it, looking down. Big glass of orange juice for Clark. Alejandro wrote it down. That all sound good to you? Hemingway asked me. And a waffle, I said. He gestured to Alejandro with that smile. Solo pastel de plancha. Only pancakes here, partner. That all right? I nodded. Coming right up, Alejandro walked off. I noticed that he had a crooked back and a slight limp. He moved slowly. He speaks good English, I said. Better than we do. For some reason, he doesn't like to speak it, but he's good. See, I said. He nodded, that smile. Feeling better, I see. I'd like to go to Africa. I was there way back in '33. Alejandro a lot more recently. He fought against the Desert Fox, a brilliant German general. You ever hear of him? No, sir, I said. The world was full of color now and interest. Desert foxes and Bowie knives and duels, lions and charging water buffaloes. He looked me over again. How old are you? I told him. Your daddy never told you about the Desert Fox? No. Great general. His name was Rommel, Erwin Rommel. He was forced to take cyanide by Herr Hitler toward the end. What were you, 7 or 8 when the war ended? Yes, sir. You know about Hitler? Yes, I do, sir. How come you don't like your name? A minute ago, you looked like you were ashamed of it. No, I told him. I think it's a good name. Yes, sir. You know, it comes from the English word for clerk. They still pronounce clerk there as Clark. I simply nodded. I didn't like my name either when I was your age. Ernest, Ernie. That's what I really didn't like, Ernie. I thought it sounded puny. I think it sounds friendly, I said. He nodded. Are you going to be a writer? I shrugged. Still not sure myself. He made a little scoffing sound. And you know about Hitler. What about Mussolini and Stalin? Yes, I said. He lifted his newspaper and held it open, probably in some way intending to compliment me by being unsurprised that I knew the other names. On the other side of the page, I saw Forrestal's picture. My heart jumped. My father knew him. I pointed. He turned the edge down with his heavy fingers to look, then folded the section to the page with the article, holding it in one hand and sipping the wine. That's right, the paralytic's Navy boy. Your father knew him, huh? I repeated the phrase, paralytic's Navy boy. I thought he might be referring to my father in some way. Franklin D.'s boy, Secretary of the Navy. Franklin D. was Assistant Secretary of the Navy before he got to be president. And Forrestal was our first Secretary of Defense. Didn't you know Franklin D. was a cripple? I said, you knew the president? Sure. My father was in the Navy, I said. He was stationed at the hospital where Forrestal... I didn't finish the sentence. Ah, right, Bethesda Naval Hospital. Yes, sir. Well, when Alexandro brought the orange juice, I said to him, you were in Africa too. He glanced at Hemingway, who returned the gaze, grinning now. It was like some kind of joke between them. Then it seemed suddenly serious from the expression on Alejandro's face. Just that you were there, Hemingway said quietly to him. Oh, si, jovencito, Alexandro said to me. Then, I was there all right, young man, I was there. He went on back to the kitchen. Hemingway leaned close. I saw the sun damage on both sides of his nose. The war, he said, low, doesn't like to talk about it. He's an honest-to-God hero, though. Served in a tank battalion. You know what that is? A tank battalion? I had enough of an idea of it to nod that I did. Were you in the war, too? I asked him. I remembered seeing a picture of him standing with some soldiers behind some kind of truck or jeep. I wanted him to tell about it. He looked grave for a moment, the index finger of his left hand tapping lightly on the table. I've been in all of them, he said, in this century. He straightened and stretched, arms up, fists at his ears. With this latest one, when we rolled into Paris, I got to liberate the Ritz Bar. You ever hear of the Ritz Bar? I nodded and smiled at him for the first time. There, Hemingway said, good, you are feeling better. You never heard of the Ritz Bar? No, sir. He laughed. It was a surprisingly high-pitched laugh. Then he took a sip of the wine. The sun from the far window sparkled in the straw shadow of it, color of it. I have 3 sons myself, you know, grown men. You'd like them. I nodded, but he was looking at the paper, reading the article about Forrestal. The silence lengthened. For a minute, it was like we were old friends, used to being in each other's company and not needing to talk. But the time went on, and I thought maybe he'd forgotten I was there. I still had his handkerchief, so I put it on the table. He looked over the paper at me, saw the handkerchief, and put it back. It says here that his family claims he was just exhausted, not crazy. Does it say anything about broken glass? He looked back at the paper and then at me again. Broken glass? They found broken glass in his bed. It's a secret. My father said not to tell anyone. You just told me, kid. I know, I'm sorry. For a second, I thought I might need the handkerchief again. Don't worry, partner, we won't tell anybody else. I nodded and put on a smile. So your father and he were friends. They spent time every day while Mr. Forrestal was in the hospital. Yes, sir. Hemingway combed one heavy hand through his thinning hair. Did your father know him before the hospital? I hesitated, trying to decide exactly what the truth about it must be. Your father's Navy. This guy was Navy, too. They formed a bond. I was just using the captain's phrase. Well, what brings all of you down this way? The Zionists may be after my father. I did not understand why I felt the need to lie just then, and I think this was when I realized that it might not exactly be a lie. Certainly the captain was worried about the possibility. Do you know who Forrestal was? Hemingway asked. Not really. The captain's friend. The captain. My father. You call him that? I shrugged. Does he know you call him that? I shrugged again, feeling caught out. Well, it's none of my business. No need to worry about it now, partner. Hemingway turned the newspaper over and laid it flat so the article about Forrestal was up. He smoothed it with both hands. Forrestal was important in the government, but you knew that, right? So what about the feds? They after your father, too? Yes, I told him. I believe the feds are, too. So he's in hiding. Now Hemingway's smile was broad, stretching all the way across his wide jaw. Down here, not a good place to hide from the feds. There's feds crawling all over the place down this way, kid. That's why I'm here instead of the Floridita. I looked around the empty room. I'd like to talk to your father. His eyes narrowed. I felt that he was looking deep into me now. We just sat staring at each other for what seemed a long time. Presently, two men came into the place and walked directly over to our table as if they had an appointment with us. I shrunk back at their approach, and Hemingway reached over to steady me. His rough hand was on my arm for a second. No one had touched me in a long time. It got me sniffling again. The taller of the two men was bald, with thin strands of black hair combed over from a part just above his left ear. He had a camera on his chest, secured by a little strap hanging from his neck. "I'm Ed Volker," he said, and then tilted his head toward the shorter one with him. "This is Ty Blaisdell. We're with the Miami Star-Tribune." Blaisdell had a blue baseball cap with a big red M. He looked way younger. He was rubbing his hands together oddly, shifting his weight from side to side. It came to me that he was excited to meet the famous author and hunter. The one named Blaisdell saw the paper open on the table and read the name aloud in the headline. Forrestal, what a thing. Volker took a picture of Hemingway, who just sat there while he took two more. "I know someone who covers politics in D.C., Blaisdell said, and he swears you could see it coming a mile away. Guy was a suicide waiting to happen." Hemingway took a drink of the wine and simply gazed back at him. "I can't imagine jumping, though, can you?" Evidently, there's some question. "Oh, that's thinking like a novelist," said Volker. "No," Hemingway told him, "that's what this article's about. Family says he wouldn't do that to himself, says he was terrified of heights." Then looking at me, "What do you think there, partner? That sound true?" I gave him a look that I hoped communicated the need for secrecy. He nodded slightly and looked back at the man. "About jumping, not much of a way to go, I guess. I think drowning or freezing to death. A bullet in the brain pan. I think you just go to sleep when you freeze to death, but suffer a lot before the siesta starts." Volker snapped another picture, then stood back and muttered, "Anyway, all that time falling, and from that height a body would break it open like a watermelon." Hemingway reached over again and lightly patted my arm, and when I looked at him, he winked. I never liked watermelon. "I guess if you've gone crazy, you don't really care how you do it. This young man's father knew him," Hemingway said, indicating me. "That's so," said Blaisdell, but he seemed to brush this aside. "Well, actually, we do have a reason to be in Havana. Your wife said we'd find you here, but that you'd probably be working." "I'm being lazy this morning," Hemingway told him. "Miss Mary knows quite well I'm not working. I've just finished the best thing I've ever done, and I'm thinking of hunting big game with my partner here." He indicated me again and winked. "Let's say we go to Africa, partner." Volker said, "What's it like spending time with Gary Cooper and Ingrid Bergman?" "I haven't seen those two fine people in a while. Supposed to see Coop soon enough, though. Do some hunting in Idaho. Fine fella." "What are they really like?" Blaisdell asked. "What's Marlene Dietrich like?" "Sexy as you think she is." "And Coop?" Hemingway smiled and nodded. "Coop's sexy, too." "No, really." He stared. After a beat, he nodded, muttering, "They're fine people. Topping, as we say." Blaisdell took off his baseball cap and moved to stand next to Hemingway's chair. "Take another picture, Ed." "Actually, we're about to eat," Hemingway told them. "Won't take a second," said Volker, focusing. He snapped it. "Thank you so much," Blaisdell said. "Listen, I know it's ridiculous, but the paper actually wants us to ask your opinion about the Nobel Committee not awarding a prize for 48. Hemingway sipped the wine and gazed at the shifting sunlight in it. The two men glanced at one another. "God damn it, Ty, it's too soon," Volker muttered. "What did Miss Mary tell you to do? She tell you to get me talking, have a drink with me?" They were silent. "She didn't say I'd be working. I know goddamn good and well she didn't say that." "I can't drink at this hour of the morning," Volker said. Hemingway's annoyance was obvious now. "No opinion." "Seems odd, don't you think? No prize. I just told you what I think." "Can you say something more about your new book?" Blaisdell asked. This changed things a little. Hemingway took another drink of the wine. "You should try this in the morning sometime, boys. Very good for the spirit, like fuel for an engine." He looked at me. "Isn't that right, partner?" "Yes," I said. Alejandro, he called. "Isn't that right, amigo?" Alejandro was standing in the entrance to the kitchen. "Si, Papa," he said. Hemingway looked at the two men. He was still holding a glass of wine. "Otro amigo," Alejandro went on into the kitchen. "From South Texas, 25 years old and badly wounded at El Alamein," Henry said low. He took out a Panzer single-handed with a sticky bomb laid into the tread. The others said nothing. "So, you want to talk about the new book?" "Man, yes, we do," Blaisdell broke forth in an enthusiastic tone that even an unhappy 12-year-old boy could see was embarrassing. "Well, it's got everything I know in it," Hemingway said, "and it's built solid as the hull of a ship." Alejandro brought the second bottle of wine, already open. He filled the glass and set the bottle in the bucket as he removed the empty one. You sure you don't want some of this, Hemingway asked him. Across the river and into the trees, Volker said. Great title. Hemingway smiled broadly. You saw it in the magazine? Do you want to tell us more about it? A woman came in then and walked over to the table. Volker, she said. She was blonde and wiry with perfect skin. I thought of the captain's wife upstairs, the same long legs, the same dark lipstick. Mr. Hemingway, she said, are you liberating this place? You know that story. Doesn't everyone? Well, Paris wasn't all fun and games. It was the end of the war, but it wasn't all fun and games. We saw plenty of fighting on the way in. I heard you had a sidearm against regulations. Hemingway's jaw tightened. I had a brigade, madam, at a place called Rambouillet. I was with a group of partisans. We had headquarters in a bombed-out hotel. She said, can I quote you? This is already out there, he said. I'll tell you this, though. I saw action. I had 122 shures before I got to Paris. Shures? Kills. Nazis. You remember the war? His smile was brittle and fleeting. Quite, she said. You with these two, he asked her. We're in the same business, said the woman. I'm Helen Talbot. I'm not averse to having a glass of wine. Did my wife send you? I don't understand the question. Vanity Fair sent me. And you want to know what I think of the lack of a prize recipient in a certain award. That and a couple other things. I didn't know about these kills. I don't talk about them. It's already reported, truly, several times over. Will you write about them? About death? I've been writing about that my whole life. How does it feel to be a legend? How do you feel about it? She left a pause. I don't have an opinion about the 48 Nobel, all right? I never even think of it, nor of anything like it or near it. And about the new book, can you talk about that? Did you see it in the magazine? Yes, but I wondered what you meant to say with it, the old soldier and the young girl. You remind me of somebody, he said, and there's nothing else to say. She stayed silent. What I have to say is it, itself, that, the book. I see. You'll excuse us, he gave her another brittle smile. Quite probably you're nothing like who you remind me of, but let's call it a morning's work, shall we? Alejandro brought our breakfast out on a big tray. I felt an almost unreasonable sense of relief. I remember that I thought we could go back to talking about lions. Volker was muttering at the woman, and Blaisdell took hold of his elbow and was trying to move him toward the door. We could stay and order breakfast, Helen Talbot said. Blaisdell said, can't you see he's having breakfast with his grandson? They all went out and along the street away. We were quiet watching them go. Alejandro poured more of the wine. They were up early, Hemingway said. Didn't she look like somebody to you? Ninguna ex-esposa, Alejandro said. You sure? Not an ex-wife? Not somebody named Gellhorn? You didn't think of her? Alejandro shook his head, walking away. I had begun to eat the eggs. I said, she reminded me of my stepmother. Hemingway laughed. Upstairs, I said, and he laughed again. It made me very glad. I sat happily eating my eggs. I thought I had never tasted anything so good. He forked the chorizo into his mouth, chewing and looking off. It seemed like they wanted the movie stars, I said, chewing. He laughed again. It thrilled me. We were compadres. Tourists, he said, and they're supposed to be journalists. Pa, said Alejandro from the doorway. He waved one hand across his face and turned into the kitchen. Alejandro worked at the Floridito a while, Hemingway said to me. Known him a couple years now. He drank more of the wine. Then journalists, Christ. I said, God damn them. I had heard the captain say that about journalists. I was merely repeating it to please Hemingway. I started as a reporter, he said. They disgrace it. I know some very damn good journalists. He watched me scrape the eggs from the plate. You read the papers? I nodded. I had turned to the pancakes. I wish I could see a lion. Yeah, lions. You should hear the sound they make at night. And you killed one. He nodded, grinning. And water buffaloes, I said. Yep. Because I wanted to keep talking about the lions, I offered what was now the full extent of my knowledge about the buffaloes. They're so much bigger than lions. Then I added, but lions kill them. Hunting in concert, he said, maybe some, but the water buffalo has no real enemies. The other animals don't bother them. He drained the wine glass and poured still more. There was no effect of it on him that I could see. Want a taste? No, thank you. I drank my orange juice and thought about how the captain and his wife would be falling down drunk, splitting one bottle. Water buffaloes travel in herds, Hemingway said suddenly, and they'll fight for each other, so the lions stay away mostly. You killed them, one each. I waited for him to go on. Then he was just drinking the wine and watching me eat the remainder of my pancakes. Alejandro stood there watching me too. I began to feel self-conscious. Perhaps 10 minutes went by, perhaps more. Dawns on me just now that I like to watch someone eat who's really hungry, Hemingway said, pouring the last of that second bottle. He held the glass up. To us soldiers. Alejandro said, soldiers, but he just nodded. Hemingway drank, then belched soundlessly and put the glass down. I saw his eyes, the light in them and the way they moved, taking everything in. He kept watching the door. I hadn't noticed that earlier. Those journalists, as they'd call themselves, thought you were my grandson. I said, funny. Suddenly, out of nothing I could name, I had an urge to ask him if the things he had told me were true. I knew that I would not do so, but somehow I felt strangely, wordlessly certain that there had been no stabbing of a charging water buffalo with a Bowie knife, nor any killing of 100 krauts. So then I was sitting there with my full stomach wondering why a person of his size and importance would lie to a boy like me about such things. Also, I recall the notion that there was something to learn from him in the fact of it, to have an advantage as I went on with the captain and his wife. I thought it was part of being a grown-up. But then, too, I recall hoping with a guilty ache that no one would ever catch him out in his lies. I said, thank you for the breakfast, Papa, and he clapped his hands together and leaned back, smiling that smile. My pleasure, Clark. My pleasure. In the next minute, the captain was there, in Bermuda shorts and a sleeveless undershirt. He scowled at me until it registered with him who was sitting across from me. Quickly, he offered his hand. Very, very excited to meet you, sir. Hemingway looked at me. This your papa? I was ashamed, nodding. I'm his father, yes, the captain said quickly. I hope he hasn't been bothering you. Not a bit of it. Get up, boy. He cuffed me lightly, painlessly on the back of my head, though the fact of it hurt. Don't overstay your welcome. Do you know who this is? He's not bothering me, said Hemingway. We're talking about going on safari together. Isn't that right, partner? I had stood out of my chair, fighting tears. Alejandro had come back into the room. Come on, Hemingway said gently to me. Sit down. It's all right. Finish your breakfast. You still got half a muffin left. The captain, uninvited, pulled another chair over and then seemed to think about it. Excuse me, would you mind if I just brought my wife down? I have to put a shirt on. Hemingway turned to Alejandro and indicated the bottle. Uno más, amigo. Si. I'll be right back, the captain said, backing toward the stairs. Won't be a second. Good. We can talk about Forrestal. He paused, straightened slightly, which was when I realized that he'd been hunched over like somebody cringing in the cold. Yes, of course. Then looking at me, wait here. His voice was full of displeasure and suspicion. He turned and was gone. I looked at Hemingway, who smiled that smile, and then leaned toward me and with his hand on the paper with the article about Forrestal said, truly, partner, it's all right. I don't remember how much time went by. It seemed long. Alejandro brought the wine. Hemingway downed a glass of it and asked for a daiquiri, and Alejandro brought that. Another journalist, a slack-looking, wiry man, came in and also wanted to know what the lack of a prize for 48 meant. Hemingway waved his hand across his face and said, is that all you want to talk about? My boss wants to know. You want a drink, some coffee? The price is we don't talk about that shit. The journalist muttered that he had a job to do and left. Did you notice, Hemingway asked me, that none of his clothes fit him? They all looked a size too big. At last, the captain came down, dressed and alone. I'm so sorry, he said. She'll be right down. She just needs to freshen up a bit. Did you see this? Hemingway asked him, indicating the paper lying open on the table. The captain stared at it for an awkward few seconds while Hemingway and Alejandro and I watched him. It occurred to me that he was reading it. He sat down slowly, still staring at it. Coffee, Senor, Alejandro said. The captain nodded absently. I'm not supposed to say anything about it, but we found broken glass in his bed. Hemingway glanced my way while feigning surprise. You don't say. You knew him well? The captain looked at me. Clark here says you were his friend. Well, now Hemingway leaned back, clasped his hands under his chin, and smiled broadly. Tough to be a real friend to that sort of character. You knew him? Met him in France during the war. To me, he seemed like an unpleasant little son of a bitch, but very efficient and very smart. The captain was quiet. Alejandro brought his coffee. And you liked him, Hemingway said. Well, he seemed to me like a doubled-up fist, he went on. The type who would depopulate a country to get his own way. He was very strict, my father said, and really, yeah, I guess so, not very pleasant. I couldn't believe it. The man who had formed a bond. I looked at him, at the folds of his white shirt, the collar, the one button that was undone halfway down the front. Suddenly I knew Hemingway was lying about knowing Forrestal as he had lied about the other things, toying with the captain for my benefit, and that the captain was suffering, and that this morning was all part of the badness from a suicide and fear and flight to a country none of us knew, and a friend who had lied and taken money and disappeared. In that moment, for the first time in my life, I saw my father as a person. I saw a man down on his luck, and I wanted Hemingway to stop. He had bought me breakfast and was supposed to be my friend, but I want him to let my father alone. I said, we think the Zionists might have killed him, and they might be after us. My father looked at me, and all the years of my little journey to 12 years old, when he was far from me and I was alone with one woman or another, all that time away shone in his eyes. I had the sense that he saw me suddenly as a stranger who was being kind. He leaned forward and took the last piece of my English muffin and put it to his lips. Nothing to worry about, boy, nodding at me. Honest, we'll be all right. But that's why you're in Cuba, Hemingway said to both of us. My father explained about Coldrow and the charter fishing idea, the money, the burned-down cottage. It was as though he were a boy talking to a big grown-up. So what'll you do, Hemingway asked, grinning. Oh, we'll probably head back north. He leaned forward. This place is crawling with feds, you know. The captain shook his head. Crime bosses own Havana. Everything goes through them, Hemingway said, and the feds can only watch. And then they were talking about that. For a while, they were just two older men trading news accounts and rumors about Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano and the others. I sat there. Hemingway began to tell about his war, drinking the daiquiri and the wine. My father had some of the wine, staring wide-eyed at the famous man going on about Schurz and his new book, The Mistakes and Incompetence of the Military Men He Had Known. It was all dull to me now, and I wanted to go back upstairs. I had found out that we were going to head back north. The blank future was ahead of us. That future contained, of course, Hemingway's own suicide, the captain's divorce from his wife, who returned to Virginia and happily raised a family, and his remarriage to a woman named Mavis, now my dear friend Mavis, who gave him years of unexpected contentment, my own time in the catastrophe of Vietnam, my years in a kind of careful friendship with the captain, and his eventual adoption of that form of address, too. I called him Captain through the last years, actually with great affection. Now and then we would talk about that time in Cuba when we met Hemingway. It was noon before my stepmother walked into the cafe wearing a crisp red sleeveless dress with a deep V in front and high-heeled shoes. Hemingway was getting ready to leave. He glanced at her as she came in, then sat up a little and took her in. Alejandro had brought him another coffee. My stepmother said good morning to the room and sat down, arranging her dress over her thighs. This is Abby, the captain said, my wife. Hello, Abby, Hemingway said, smiling widely. You're quite a bit younger than the captain here, aren't you? 14 years, she said. It was clear even to me that he had only meant to compliment her youthful appearance. He hesitated only slightly and went on. Well, Abby, I always liked that name, and you remind me of someone. His eyes were cloudy. He drained the coffee, building up to say something, but she interrupted him. We don't want to keep you. Reaching into her purse, she brought out a fountain pen and a piece of notepad paper, leaned forward and offered it to Hemingway, if you'd be so kind. He smiled, the wonderful smile, and gave a little sighing shrug, and I had a sudden intimation, without the means to express it, of what the whole morning had cost him, the strain of being who he was in that place and at that time, the world as it was then, keeping up with its fabrications. And I'm convinced that I knew somehow, sudden as a spark and a dozen years before it happened, how his life would end. Because I thought of Forrestal and the newspaper man's political friends saying you could see his suicide from a mile away. At the time, though, it seemed only an importunate thought, random, having nothing to do with us. Hemingway took the pen, his hand trembling very slightly, and signed his name.